since 2005, the policy shift had been initiated regarding the limitations of the housing policy and programs in changing the nature and structure of South African cities, particularly the reinforcement of exclusion in the way that the structure of the city reproduced itself. From our point of view, already in leading up to 2005, which is nearly 10 years in policy application, program application, and then by 2009 it's 15 years, it starts suggesting that we need to understand the pathways that were chosen to address the constitutional concern for housing and the shelter deficit. So the housing policy paper responds to that and then attempts to say that there's a bigger concern beyond housing and the limitations of the housing program, but that we're not creating enough of responsiveness in the built environment to accommodate moderate and poor people and create ladders in the housing market, allowing entry and exit. During the last 20 years, quite a strong iterative exercise between citizen-led information, knowledge and evidence, state responses and market responses. So what we're seeing is this bodies of research that respond to market, bodies of research that respond to citizens making claims on the state, and bodies of work responding to how the state responds. So we're seeing these multiple bodies of knowledge come together. And I think my sense about that is, how do we make sense of these different bodies of knowledge? They make claims on policy directions based on their own bodies of evidence, and part of the responsiveness of a policy maker and program designer from a government point of view is, how do you respond to these different bodies of knowledge and information and adjudicate them?
We could not just take one research finding or one piece of research that had certain findings to be the policy direction we should be taking. We needed a kind of a synthesis that brings together what different aspects of the policy dimensions were being interrogated for.
Under the family of research synthesis, we have different methods again, and one of these is the evidence mapping method, which we adopted in this project on human settlement policy making. Evidence mapping, as all methods of research synthesis, follows an explicit, transparent and structured process.
What the evidence map basically does is provide for different types of outcomes and for different components what evidence currently exists. You can then go into each of those pieces of evidence and see a summary of them. But what it doesn't do per se is summarize what all that evidence is telling you.
Traditionally within DPME, the way that evidence would be generated is that within DPME, of course, somebody would draft their terms of reference, and the terms of reference would be advertised, generally in newspapers and our tender bulletin. But when we got them out, we had a very slow and very low response rate from the community. There were a lot of researchers who were apprehensive about the methodology. So you couldn't get a team of researchers who are confident about the methodology and also confident about the human settlements sector.
When we experienced those problems of not finding an appropriate researcher or research community to be able to respond to our procurement request, we then found that we had to not just find a solution that was creative, but to actually start building these relationships. And luckily for us, at the time, DPME is in partnership with UJ-BCURE. So that is a DFID-funded project building capacity for the uptake of research evidence that is housed at the moment at University of Johannesburg. It was new to both sides, and we in government didn't have the methodology expertise, especially around systematic reviews and evidence synthesis that this methodology draws on. We had the policy will to bring about a new methodology, but we didn't have the expertise. In DPME, we introduced then a creative method. We took on this whole matchmaking approach. The matchmaking approach was really there's technical expertise that exists among the research community, both in terms of content specialists, we call them content sector specialists, the methodology specialists, the information specialists, the business intelligence specialists, because it was a whole platform that was being built. That kind of expertise exists, but in government we also have similar expertise from a different perspective. Now we took a huge experiment, I would say maybe a risk upfront, to match these kind of expertise from the private research community, so private sector together with the public sector, and actually give them the instruction that you will work together.
I was impressed from a perspective of the use of experts, the use of evidence, the combination of different domain experts, be they from IT, be they from planning, housing, but also, I suppose, the combination of state and research community.
Clearly, there's lots of lessons to be learned from this, and we had to go back to stakeholders that were involved in this process to say, would you validate this methodology? Would you be able to say that this is a pilot and go beyond this as a pilot? And the stakeholder meetings were very productive, and they clearly endorsed this process, which made the challenges that we did experience worth it in the end.
What happened in our first session, where we ran this past the very people who were party to constructing the framework for interrogating the different knowledge sets, was that they were really fascinated about what it offered by way of interpretations, by way of ways in which the interventions produce different outcomes, and the ways in which we can adjudicate it. And my sense is that they wanted more of it. They wanted a way in which this is applied more systematically, and that there's a commitment to using the material in this way to interrogate their own strengths and limitations.
We think it provides a good basis for doing similar work in other sectors. So, for example, we have 14 outcomes that we focus on, and it would be really good to get evidence maps in each of those 14 outcomes, but you actually would need a few for each outcome, not necessarily one, because they're very broad. And again, using that to set an evidence agenda for DPME, where it needs to collect, whether it's evaluations or research or other form of evidence collection, and where actually there's a lot that we can then target and do more evidence synthesis of what already exists.
What this does is it tries to address complexity and say there's many bodies of research in multiple disciplines in a particular domain, and that we need to find ways to adjudicate it. And that's what's really happened at this point, that there's no absolute right or wrong, that the evidence has to be supported, and that there may be other bodies of evidence that need to be considered. And I think that that's incredibly valuable for policymakers.
What the tool has demonstrated, it asks questions about the usefulness of what we think we know in a particular domain for the public at large. It is democratizing research for us, but maybe I think for the state as well, it's also asking of the state to ask the right questions.
From an international perspective, there's a growing drive towards the use of evidence during decision making. For example, in the UK, there are work centers. And likewise, under the Obama administration in the States, evidence has received a higher role within the policymaking process. However, if we talk about research synthesis itself, it's not as much institutionalized within government structures. There are international organizations that do so, 3IE and the World Bank, for example, and also development agencies like DFID. But for a government department to produce an evidence synthesis in-house to inform decision-making, to our knowledge, is the world's first. So South Africa, in this sense, is a thought leader on how to institutionalize the use of evidence synthesis during decision-making.